There is a framed photograph on the wall of Mitchell Garvin's office. I noticed it the moment I walked in. It shows a completed culvert project from 2014, concrete headwalls, rip-wrap apron, clean sight lines down the channel. I designed that culvert. I drew the specs. I stood in the mud during the pour. Mitchell wasn't there that day. He had a client lunch. I looked at that photograph for exactly as long as it took him to read the letter I'd placed on his desk. Then I looked at him. He started to say something. I said, "Lawrence couldn't handle the work anymore, so we parted ways." His face did something. I won't tell you what I called it. I'll tell you what it looked like. It looked like a man who had just understood, for the first time, that someone had been paying attention. Welcome to real-life verdict. Get comfortable. The people in this story had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment, hit that like button, and make sure you're subscribed. Let me back up. My name is Lawrence. I am 64 years old. I spent 38 years doing municipal infrastructure work, water systems, drainage, small bridges, the unglamorous things that make a place function. The work that nobody thinks about until it fails. I drove a 2006 Honda Accord with 187,000 miles and a tear in the driver's seat leather I'd patched with duct tape. The tape held. That was good enough for me. In 2008, I co-founded Becker Garvin Municipal Consulting with a former colleague named Mitchell Garvin. Mitchell and I had worked together in the 1990s at a larger firm. He was organized, personable, good at keeping clients comfortable in rooms where I was focused on the problem on the table. We complemented each other, which is a phrase people use when two people are useful to each other for different reasons. I believed it applied to us. We ran the firm for 13 years. I handled the technical work and the client relationships. Mitchell managed contracts and business development. The phone rang because of the reputation I'd built in this region over 3 decades. The proposals got assembled because Mitchell knew how to put a package together. It worked. In September 2021, we dissolved the partnership. Mitchell wanted to move into private development work, residential and commercial clients, a different kind of business. I had no interest in that. Public infrastructure was what I knew and what I cared about. The split was civil. Our attorney, a woman named Angela Pryor, drafted a clean separation agreement. We divided the client list. We shook hands. I want you to understand what I thought I was walking away from. I thought I was walking away from a business arrangement that had run its course. I thought Mitchell and I would see each other occasionally at the county engineers meeting, exchange a nod, and move on. Mitchell also signed a non-disparagement clause. Page 4, paragraph 7. Mutual. Neither of us could make statements that harmed the other's professional reputation. I signed it. He signed it. Angela filed it. I took the original home and put it in the filing cabinet in my garage, between a folder of tax records from 2019 and the deed to the house. I filed it there because that's where I file important documents, not because I thought I'd ever need it. That was my one miscalculation about Mitchell Garvin. I assumed he was the kind of man who remembered what he'd signed. October 2023, I submitted a proposal for a stormwater study to a county planning department I'd worked with before, a routine study, the kind of work I'd done 40 times. 3 weeks later, I received a polite rejection email. The department had selected another consultant. That was not unusual. The last line was, they wrote that they'd selected a consultant with fewer transitional concerns. I read that phrase twice. I wasn't sure what it referred to. I was solo now, no longer part of a partnership, and I assumed they meant something about capacity, whether one man could handle their scope. I filed the email and moved on. I didn't know what transitional concerns meant, but the phrase stayed with me the way a small sound stays with you in a house at night. Not alarming, just present. December 2023. I met a borough manager for coffee at a diner off Route 322. A man named Tom, someone I'd worked with for a decade. We'd done 3 projects together when I was at Becker Garvin. Waterline work, drainage improvements. I knew his wife's name. I'd been to his retirement party for his previous job. He told me they had a waterline project coming out for bid. He asked if I was back in good standing. I said I didn't understand the question. He picked up his coffee. He said he just wanted to make sure I was settled in the new arrangement. He changed the subject. We talked about the project for another 20 minutes and I left. Back in good standing. That phrase assumes you are out of it. I drove home on Route 322 and I thought about what Tom had asked me. I thought about it for 3 days. Then I filed it alongside the October email in a part of my mind where I put things I didn't yet know how to categorize. January 2024, a prospective client I'd never worked with called and asked if I could provide references from my previous firm. I gave 3 names. A project engineer I'd worked with in 2019. A borough solicitor I'd consulted on 2 drainage matters. A senior inspector at the state DOT who'd worked alongside us on a bridge project. All reliable people. All people who knew the truth. A week later, the prospective client left a voicemail. They'd decided to go in a different direction. No details. I called one of the references I'd provided. The project engineer, a man named Dale. I asked him if he'd been contacted. He said yes. I asked him what they'd asked him. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, they asked whether I'd left the partnership voluntarily. He told them the truth, that I'd dissolved the partnership on mutual terms. But then he said, Lawrence, why would they ask it that way? Voluntarily. Like there was another option. I said I didn't know. I want you to stay with me here, because this is the part where the floor started moving under my feet, even though I was standing completely still. 3 things. October. December. January. A phrase that implied concern. A phrase that implied I'd fallen out of good standing. A question designed to imply I hadn't left on my own terms. I wonder if I was seeing something that wasn't there. 3 data points can be coincidence. I had done this work long enough to know that regional markets are small, and information is imprecise, and sometimes perception lags reality for reasons that have nothing to do with anyone's intentions. I was not ready to name a conclusion. I needed one more thing. February 2024, I was at my kitchen table on a Tuesday evening when my email chimed. Carol Renwick. Carol was a municipal engineer for a mid-sized borough where both Mitchell and I had bid work. She wore the same insulated vest from October to April and kept a coffee mug on her desk that said I'd rather be fishing. I had known her professionally for 11 years. The email had no message in the body. She had forwarded me an email from Mitchell, a proposal email he'd sent to a shared municipal client. In the email, Mitchell wrote that his firm was better positioned than competitors who've recently restructured and that some former partners have found solo practice challenging after leaving larger organizations. I read that email 3 times. Carol's subject line said, I thought you should know what he's saying. I sat at that table for a while. I did not respond to Carol that night. I thought about how carefully Mitchell had written that sentence. No accusation, no names, just an implication, embedded in a business proposal, designed to pass through a prospective client's mind and leave something behind, without anyone being able to point to it later. Almost no one would notice. Almost no one would forward it. I had one thing he hadn't considered, but I wasn't ready to use it yet. March 14, 2024, I drove to a regional water authority to discuss a proposal I'd submitted. The project manager was a man I'd spoken with twice before. Professional, efficient, the kind of person who gets to the point. We sat in the conference room. He had my proposal on the table in front of him. He told me they'd heard I'd left my previous partnership under a cloud. He said it gently. He wasn't being unkind. He was giving me a chance to respond. I asked him where he'd heard that. He hesitated. Then he said it had come up in a conversation with another consultant. I thanked him for considering my proposal. I stood up. I shook his hand. I walked out to the parking lot and sat in the Accord for a moment. October, December, January, February, March. Not coincidence, not perception lag, not a small market and imprecise information. One person, one sentence repeated in different rooms to different people. Lawrence couldn't handle the work anymore, so we parted ways. I drove home. I went into the garage and opened the filing cabinet between the 2019 tax folder and the house deed. I found the partnership dissolution agreement. I turned to page 4. I read paragraph 7. Then I called Angela Pryor. Angela's office is in Mechanicsburg, 20 minutes from mine. She has a framed photograph on her desk of her and her husband standing in front of a half-built house they general contracted themselves in 1994. 30 years later, the photograph is still there. I brought the dissolution agreement, Carol's forwarded email, and notes from the 3 contracts. Angela read for a few minutes. She turned to page 4. She looked up. She asked if I wanted to file suit. I said no. I wanted him to stop. She said she'd draft a cease and desist letter. She asked if I wanted her to send it. I asked if I could deliver it myself. She said, "He signed this. He knows what he signed. You don't need to give him a second chance, but if you want to, I'll make sure he understands. It's the last one." I told her I wanted to. A few days later, I was sitting in Brian Hastings' truck in a parking lot outside a diner in Camp Hill. Brian drove a 15-year-old F-250 with a toolbox bolted in the bed. He had a laminated map of the county's water infrastructure taped to the dashboard even though he had GPS. Brian had worked in this region as a contractor for 25 years. He knew the community, the projects, the politics. I told him what Mitchell had been doing. I didn't frame it as a question. I told him what I was going to do. Brian listened. He didn't interrupt. At the end, he said, "If you need someone to sit in that meeting with you, I'll be there." I said I wouldn't need him. He nodded. We sat in the truck in silence for about a minute. Then he said, "Good." I got back in the Accord and drove to my office. Angela's letter was on my desk. I read it once. It was exactly right. I had 22 days before I was ready to walk through Mitchell's door. Here is what Mitchell assumed about me. He assumed that a 64-year-old man working solo, without a firm name and a staff and a business development budget, was a diminishing presence in this market. He assumed that a few vague implications, spread through the comfortable informality of proposal conversations and casual meetings, would not be traced back to him. He assumed that another consultant was a safe attribution. He assumed that I, like many people my age who encounter bureaucratic difficulty, would attribute my lost contracts to the market or my circumstances, and not look any further. He assumed that I didn't keep things. I want you to understand something about me. I filed that dissolution agreement in September 2021, and did not think about it again for 2.5 years. I didn't keep it because I was waiting for a reason to use it. I kept it because I keep important documents. It's the same reason I still have every client letter from the last 15 years in a filing system I've maintained since 2001. The same reason I can tell you the name of every project I worked on from 2008 to 2021, and every person who was on the other side of those conversations. Mitchell spent 6 months building a story about what happened to me. I had 23 years of receipts. What he did not know, what he could not have known, because he stopped paying attention to me the moment the dissolution agreement was signed, was that every client relationship from those 13 years I had maintained. Not aggressively, not strategically, just consistently. A call when a project wrapped, a note when a borough manager changed positions. I did it because those were people I'd worked with and I respected what they'd given me. I did it the way I do most things, without announcement. My reputation in this region predates Becker Garvin by 25 years. Mitchell's predates it by nothing. He signed a clause that prohibited him from damaging something he didn't understand the dimensions of. That was his mistake. April 5th, 2024. 9:40 in the morning. Mitchell's office is on the second floor of a professional building in Lemoyne. His assistant wasn't at her desk when I arrived. I walked straight in. He was on the phone. He looked up, and he saw me, and he ended the call mid-sentence. I didn't greet him. I walked to his desk and placed the dissolution agreement on it. Open to page 4. I placed Angela's cease and desist letter on top. I did not sit down. He read the letter. I waited. He looked up. He opened his mouth. I said, "Lawrence couldn't handle the work anymore, so we parted ways." The room was quiet for a moment. I named the 3 contracts. I named the clients. I told him he had 48 hours to send written retractions to every client and prospective client he'd contacted. If I lost another contract after that, Angela would file a lawsuit for tortious interference with business relationships. Page 4, paragraph 7. His signature was on the bottom. He asked if we could work this out. I picked up the dissolution agreement. I left the cease and desist letter on his desk. I said we already did. September 2021. Then I left. I did not shake his hand. I did not look at the photograph of the culvert project on my way out. I walked down the stairs and through the front door and into the parking lot. It was a cool morning. I could see my breath. I got in the Accord and sat for a moment. Not long. Then I drove to my office, filed the dissolution agreement back in the cabinet, and called Angela. She asked if Mitchell would comply. I said he would. He had 48 hours and no defense. He knew what he'd signed. He knew what he'd signed. He knew what I had. And he knew I'd made sure of it, that the same clients he'd tried to reach with his version of events were about to receive a written retraction with his signature on it. In a small regional market, that retraction was its own consequence. I hung up the phone. I made a cup of coffee. I had a proposal to finish. The work was waiting, the way it always is, and I was still the man best qualified to do it. That hadn't changed, it just needed documenting.